Okay, so in the box with the new pads, and these particular pads are the same. Some brake pads will have automatic tabs coming out of the bottom, and you want to pay attention to which side of the rotor that brake pad with the tab goes to. But these ones are good, so happy about that. In the box, you're going to have the clamps. Make sure you got everything out of there. And then you got these little brackets here. So these little brackets go on the bottom of the brake pads. And you can reference your old pads to see. So the brake pads, the curve faces the inside of the rotor, so we know that this pad was on this side. See how it kind of takes that shape? So there is a top and there is a bottom. So the bracket is actually on the top. So what we're going to do is, just to make it simple, we're going to orient the brake pad like that. This brake pad was on the other side, again, following the curvature of the rotor. And you can see the hardware. Yeah, come on. Get it. There it is on the top. So again, we're going to take that, we're going to set it there, and then we're going to orient that pad the same exact way. So we know that the bracket, come on, focus. Here we go. We know that the bracket is going to go up here, and this bracket is going to go up here. And if you look at the other pad, you can see on the brake pad side itself is the flat part. Come on, focus, guy. Whatever. There it is. Well, you'll see it anyway. There's a flat part. So that's right there. This flat part. So you're going to put this on. So this flat part clips just like that. I wonder if I can do it one-handed. Not likely. Well, maybe. Almost got it. Nope. All right, well, whatever. It's hard to do. But just make sure that the tabs are oriented in the same way on the same, either top or bottom of each pad. Use the old pads as reference. So I'm going to put these clips on. Then I'm going to use the screwdriver to pop these off, because you'll see the new one came with 4. God, this camera sucks. It came with 4 other brackets, and there's a whole bunch of different stuff going on, little clips and tabs and directions. So you want to make sure you can see on this one. Let me try and zoom in here. You can see on this one, it has a little curve and a tab that goes in. So this is the top. So replace them one at a time. Don't pop all these off at the same time and then try and remember what went where. So figure out the orientation. So the square part is obviously going to go in the notch. So there we go. That's our orientation right there. So I'm going to pop this off and I'm going to put this in exactly like that. And then I'm going to do the same for the bottom. So the bottom looks like it goes well, there's a bottom piece here. That's not it. Here it is. So see how it's got a whole different shape and all that stuff? So this will just clip right in. And it just sits in there. I mean, there's nothing crazy about it. But make sure it's oriented the same way. Do them one at a time. Do the brake pad hardware one at a time. And then when you're ready, we'll get this reinstalled. Okay, just to walk you through this really quick. I got this one ready to go, but this is where I use the screwdriver. I just put it in here and push. That comes right out. And then this, you'll see it just kind of notches right in there. Just like that. See? And you'll see this tab kind of hugs the frame. This tab hugs the frame. This is flush. This tab, there is a gap, and that's intentional. So don't think that it's not seated properly. But I mean, you go look at the difference between the old hardware and the new hardware. That's wild. So I got this side ready to go. Now I'm just gonna flip it over and do this side. Again, using the screwdriver to pop this out. Oh, don't move on me. New tab, just line up the square. Just like that. And then I'm gonna do the same for the bottom. So our rotor is in place. All I did was seat it on here, and it doesn't matter which hole as long as they all line up. So make sure the orientation of your rotor is proper with the outdented part facing towards you. You don't want to flip it around and have the rotor on this side because that's not going to work well. So the rotor's in place. Now we got to get the bracket on now that we got the hardware changed out. So again, we want the holes where the brake caliper screws in towards the back. Those are the holes where our 17mm bolts go. So this goes around the rotor. So you'll sit this around the rotor and then put the 17mm bolts back in. This is where your anti-seize comes into play. So I just take some anti-seize and paint it around the threads. So it looks like this. And I do that for both bolts before I try and screw it back in. So I have to do this one. You can see the difference. This doesn't have anything on it yet. So I'll put some anti-seize on both bolts. And while I'm doing it, I might as well do the brake caliper bolts too. And then I kind of set them so that it doesn't fall off. So I'll anti-seize those. And then I'm gonna put this rotor bracket back on, get the bolts in. You'll need your work light to kind of see and line up the holes, but it should be pretty self-evident how this lines up. But yeah, we'll get that going. I'll be right back. Okay, so I got the bracket in place and loosened. Oh, I left the bolts a little loose just so I could show you how to align where the bracket goes. So when you seat the bracket itself will go behind the axle here. So you want to go behind, see that? You feed the bolt through the outside in on both of them. And then I'll hand tighten them, kind of alternating back and forth. And then once they're hand tight, I'll take the socket wrench and tighten them up real good. But don't crank too hard, because if you shear these bolts, you got big problems. So I'm going to tighten those up, and then we'll get on to the brake pad part. Okay, so the bracket is installed and tight. You want to make sure it's snug, everything is nice. Your brake caliper bolt receptacles are here, and these should compress a little bit. There we go. You want to make sure these compress in, because if they don't, it's going to make it more difficult for you to get the brake pad on. But first things first, we got to compress these pistons. So you'll see here, I have the C-clamp. I like to put the screw end on the back side. I didn't tighten it, my bad. I like to put this screw part on the back and the fixed part on the piston, because if you do it the other way around, it's like a balancing act, because this thing wiggles around and then it goes inside and it falls outside. So just put the fixed part on the edge of the piston, and there's two of them, so you got to do this on both sides. So you want to make sure you're on the metal right there, and then on the back you're on the metal, and then you'll tighten this down and the piston will compress, and you want to compress it all the way, but don't go too hard once it gets to the end, because you don't want to break anything. So again, when we're doing this process, you want to make sure that your brake fluid reservoir cap is off. That allows the pressure being forced back into the system to be relieved through that reservoir top. So make sure your cap is off of your brake reservoir, and then I'm going to compress this piston and we'll go from there. All right, so this piston is fully compressed. You can see the difference. See if I can get the light in there, of how far out that opposite piston is versus the one we just compressed. And now that it's compressed, it'll stay compressed. So when I take this C-clamp off, that piston isn't going anywhere. It's only going to come back out when you step on the brake pedal and push brake fluid through the system. That's how that works. So this allows us that full open mouth of the caliper to get around the thick brake pads we're putting on now, because now that they're new, they're going to be much thicker than the non-existent ones we had. So I have to compress the other piston now, so I'm going to do that, and then we'll get on to getting the pads installed. Here's another good angle of the difference between a compressed piston and the way it was before. So as you push on the brakes, these come out and they push on the side of the pad. So the more the pad wears, the further these come out. And again, they don't go back in unless you force them in. So putting the new pads on, now we're adding all that thickness back, which is why we have to compress these. So it's a significant difference, and it's impossible to get this back on the new brake pads unless you compress these. So if for some reason you're trying to compress them and they're not going, then I would be hesitant to try and force it. Sometimes they get stuck and you can break them free. Sometimes they're just jammed and you need a whole new caliper assembly. In which case, this project just became infinitely more complex. But yeah, just a good visual of the difference and why we have to compress those pistons. It's easier to have this mouth than that one. Okay, these pistons are fully compressed. Look at that, we now have a nice open caliper to fit around the brake pads. So this is good. Remember, be very cautious with this brake line. You don't want to kink it or bend it or anything. So we're gonna just kind of set this back up out of the way now that that's ready to go. Now we got to prep the pads. So double check your hardware, make sure your clamps and all this is installed properly and securely on your rotor bracket. and your brake pads. Do a double check on the orientation. So again, the brackets were at the top, so following the curvature of the brake pad with the curvature of the rotor. These are going to go in this notch here and here. So that's correct. Tabs at the top. So that's correct. And then if we put the other one on the other side, here we go. Obviously, the pad part needs to be facing the rotor because this is where they apply the pressure to brake. So make sure your brake pads are facing the rotor and they're following the curvature, the outside curvature. So again, similar, the groove, the clip is at the top, so we're good. Our hardware is on our brake pads properly. The next step is going to be applying the brake grease. So we're going to take some brake grease and we're going to apply it to this entire side and right here around these edges here, because it'll help it slide into the bracket better. So we're going to apply the grease, especially to these plates, because your pistons are going to sit, they're going to go right up against this plate, and that's what they're going to push against. So you want to have some grease to allow for smooth movement of these parts. Do not put any brake grease on the brake pad, not on the sides, not on the top, nothing. Brake grease only needs to go here, on the edges here, the bottom, on the top. You can put it on the top edge. You can put brake grease right here in these little notches on the hardware. I always put a little dab of brake grease in here on front and back. Don't get brake grease on your rotor because you need friction. If you add grease, you just took that friction away. Don't get brake grease on your rotor or on the pads themselves. So we're going to apply a little layer of brake grease on the backs of both pads, and then we'll be ready to get them installed. Okay, so I got the brake grease on the pads. I also put a little bit inside each of the brackets on the rotor. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to install them. So you're going to take the brake pad, following the curvature of the rotor with the pad facing the rotor, and you're going to find the tabs, line up the tabs with the bracket, and you're going to push them in just like that. And you can see there's a nice thick pad hitting that rotor. Beautiful. It feels safer already. All right, and then on the other side, again, pads facing the rotor, back of the pad following the curvature of the rotor. So tab is at the top. This one might be a little trickier since I can't see much, but we're gonna follow the tab. I can't see. All right, well, I can't see from this angle, so I'm gonna have to take a short break and get underneath there a little bit. But try to keep your fingers off of the grease, because otherwise you're just wearing the grease off that you just put on. So try and hold the sides. Again, try not to get any brake grease on the pads. I'll be right back. I'm gonna get this one seated. It's not that hard, it's just I can't see anything, so I gotta be able to get in there and see it. So I'll be right back once this is installed and we'll go on to the next step. But we're nearing the end here, so that's exciting. Stay tuned. All right, good. That other pad went in nice and smooth once I could see the bracket. All right, so the next step, you see our pads are in, nice and flush. This is the tricky part. So pay attention, because you gotta do a bunch of different things all at the same time, and it's the hardest part of this whole process. So first you wanna make sure your caliper bracket is oriented so that you can easily just pick it up without messing with the brake line and bring it down like that. So the pistons are gonna go on the back side, the front is gonna go over the front pad, and these holes right here are gonna line up with your caliper bolts. All right, so that's step one, is make sure that's oriented so that you can do that pretty easily. Step two, we have to add these guys. So these springs, they're pretty easy, but they have to face each other. So the little indenture in the middle, the top one will face down, the bottom one will face up, and you'll see, let me get the light, you'll see the two little holes right there, and right there and there that they go in. But as soon as you put them in the holes, they spring open and they pull the pads out of the brackets. So it's a big pain in the neck. So what I do is I set, where's the hole? I set one of them in the hole there, like that, facing down. I set the other one in the hole there, facing up. So now all I have to worry about is getting this part in here, this part in here, but you have to hold the brake pads together, put the springs in while holding them together, and then get the caliper down over the top. Once the springs are in, they're not going to pop out. So hold the brake pads together, and you're going to get brake grease on your hands, but hold the pads together, get the spring on the top in, get the spring on the bottom in. While you're holding that, get the brake caliper, use this front part to push against the pad, and then as soon as you can slide the back part of the caliper over the pad, the caliper itself will hold it in place and you can get your hand out of the way. But if you don't use the caliper and you take your hand off when these are engaged, it's just gonna pop the pads out, it's gonna get grease everywhere, it's gonna frustrate you, and it's gonna be a pain in the neck. So it's kind of a three-part series of holding, springs, caliper, all in one shot. And then once the caliper is in place, you wanna align these bolts with this, and that's why it's important that this compresses. So if this one doesn't compress, I would use the C-clamp and just clamp this to make sure it loosens up and it'll compress. And that way, this will reach all the way around the back. So I would do that first. Make sure these compress when you put pressure on them. They should, sometimes they spring back, sometimes they stay. This one stayed, but you can see how compressed this one is compared to that. So I'm gonna C-clamp this one, make sure it compresses before I go through this process. Not all brake pads have these springs. The brake pads that don't have these springs, it's no big deal. You just put the caliper on and you're good. But this particular style can be a pain if you don't prepare ahead of time. So get the caliper in a nice position where you can just nicely move it down into place. Make sure that these caliper bolt receptacles compress. That way, as you get this in place, you can make sure it'll reach. Use the front of the brake caliper to hold this pad in place while you bring the other part in back. Just slide it all around, and then that holds the pads in place so you can bolt it in. Now you also want to make sure you have the bolts ready. I already have anti-seize on them, so they're ready to go. So as I get this caliper in place and it's over there, I want them within the bolts within reach so I can get in there and thread them in really quick. Once they're threaded, you're on the home stretch and we're out of here. So let's get to it. I'm gonna compress this piece right here to make sure I can fit it, and then I'm gonna go through this process. And wish I had a tripod. I'd show you how I do it. Well, maybe I'll get one. I don't know, let me see if I can find one, because it's easier to see it than to listen to what I just explained, which is probably very convoluted and confusing. But this has to be compressed first anyway. So I'm gonna do that and I'll see if I can get a tripod. Stay tuned. Okay, so we'll see if this works, but here we go. So I have the screws, I want them handy. All right, the caliper is gonna go down like this with the pistons in the back. So I'm gonna set that like that, ready to go. I compressed this and double checked this one. You can see now that they're compressed, so the caliper should fit nicely. This is gonna go on the outside. So this bracket goes on the outside of these. This front part goes on the pad itself. So now I'm gonna get a little bit greasy. I'm gonna do the bottom one first. Where's that hole? All right. So right there. Oh, I can already feel the pads starting to. All right, and then this one goes in that hole. Yeah, see how they're starting to push out already? So this is where it gets tricky. All right, so now the caliper comes down over the front and the back. I got that in place. Now I can take my hand off. There we go. Bolt. Let's try and find it here. I think I got it. Yep. Got it. I'm going to keep pressure on this because I don't want the caliper to slide up and then have the pads go crazy again. So I get the other bolt, get it in here, and then there it is. Screw that in that way. So it's kind of a pain in the neck and you're going to get your hands greasy, but we're in. So you can see I rubbed some grease off with my hand, but nothing that can't be fixed. Not a big deal. I mean, that's a lot of grease anyway, so good there. All right. And then you can see I got the bolts in. I'm just gonna tighten these down. These are the 14 millimeters. I'm gonna tighten them down and then the brakes are done. We can put the tire back on. So stay tuned. Okay, calipers are tightened. Everything is good and secure. The rotor will be loose and it'll wiggle. But as you get the tire on, those lug nuts are gonna lock this in place. And then over time, it'll just kind of stay there on its own. But this is perfectly normal for the rotor to be loose and moving around. It's got the bracket holding it in place. It's gonna have the lug nuts holding it in place. You're good to go. You didn't do anything wrong. So I'm gonna line up the tire. I'm gonna get these lug nuts ready to go. So I'm gonna line up the tire, get the tire on, put the lug nuts hand tight, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so I got the tire back on. I got the lug nuts tightened up to a loose point, just hand tightened. Now I got to use the torque wrench, which I have a handy helper here.
Hi.
Who's got the torque wrench with a 21 millimeter impact socket. And again, these lug nuts get torqued to 76 foot-pounds or 103 newtons. So we're going to torque these down and lower the jack, and then we're good to go. Okay, we are all set. Everything is torqued up. The car is lowered. Now, you want to make sure that you check your brake fluid reservoir. See how we're above max now? Because all that fluid is pushed back up. So that's okay. That means we have a good amount of fluid in there. We're gonna put the cap back on. Sans flower petals. There we go. It just pushes right back on. I'm gonna reinstall this cover like so. Then what you're gonna wanna do is, I'm gonna close the hood. There we go. Then what you're gonna wanna do is get in the car. We're gonna start it up. Oh, pump the brakes a couple of times. This is what's gonna pump fluid back into the system. So you can pump the brake a little bit. You'll start feeling more resistance. Just slow, methodical brake pressure. Once you start the car, that's when the action's really gonna happen. So we're gonna start the car. You're gonna feel the brake be really, really squishy at first. And that's okay, that's normal. So just start the car, pump the brakes, and just keep pumping them until you feel that resistance come back. Once you feel that resistance, take it for a little test drive, make sure everything is operating properly. Start slow, make sure the brakes work. And then you'll be good to go. So I hope this video helped. Thanks again for watching. And we'll catch you on the next one. One thing I forgot to mention, after you test your brakes and you pump the brake pedal and get that resistance, if you don't feel any resistance, it doesn't mean your brakes aren't working. You should feel some resistance. Sometimes it'll feel really stiff. Sometimes it'll still feel like no change. Sometimes it might even be squishy. But you want to, pump your brakes, get the fluid back in the system. Then before you take it for a test drive, you want to come back and check your brake fluid. And you want to make sure that you're between the min and max lines. So this has a little bit above max, but we should be good to go. I just took it for a test drive and the brakes work great. No squeaking, no burning smell, no smoking, nothing. Sometimes you'll get a burning smell or smoking for the first mile or two, which is just whatever brake grease, or if you got any oil or anything from your hands on the pads or rotors, it's just that friction heat burning it off. So don't be alarmed at that. That's normal, but right now everything was clean. Everything's working great. We have our brake fluid. If you need to add brake fluid, make sure you add brake fluid. But you should be good to go. Stay tuned and follow for how to do the rear brakes and rotors. That's coming up next. Thanks again for watching.